The music box had been silent for nearly 2 decades, resting untouched in a dusty corner of the attic. Then one quiet afternoon, it played again, a trembling lullaby, soft and broken, pulling Eleanor back to the spring of 1992. That sound carried more than melody. It carried a memory, and a goodbye that was never spoken. It happened as rain tapped gently on the window, soft and steady, like a heartbeat slowing with time. Eleanor's hands, older now, still remembered the weight of the little box. She opened it, as she had done 100 times before. But this time, the lining gave way, revealing something she had never seen: a faded piece of paper, a child's handwriting, and 2 words, "Silent Goodbye." Beneath it, a hand-drawn map, leading into the woods. Lily vanished without a trace that spring. No witnesses, no cameras, only a fallen hat left behind. The police found nothing. The town eventually moved on. But Eleanor never did. Now, with one note, one scrap of paper, one map drawn by a child's hand, hope stirs again. Or is it just memory playing its cruelest trick? Eleanor Connor, 68, lived alone in a quiet, windswept corner of Rivertown, Colorado. Her house sat at the end of a narrow street, framed by dry trees and rusted fences, the kind of place where silence lingered even in daylight. She had been a music teacher once, the kind who hummed softly while grading papers, who taught shy children to find courage in their voice. People remembered her as kind, patient, gentle, a woman who never raised her voice, who never stopped believing in small miracles. But that was before 1992, before the picnic at Rocky Creek, before the day her granddaughter disappeared without a trace. Lily was 10 when she vanished. She wasn't just Eleanor's granddaughter. She was her everything. Eleanor had raised her since she was a baby, after her daughter, Lily's mother, died in a car crash on a rainy highway outside Denver. That loss nearly broke her. But Lily's laugh, her love for lullabies, her tiny hand clutching Eleanor's coat, held the pieces together. Lily was bright, curious, careful. She played the piano like her mother once did, always starting with the same song, "You Are My Sunshine." It became their song, the melody of their mornings. The two of them would sit together in the early light, playing an old music box, a gift from Lily's mother, winding it slowly, letting it fill the room with its trembling tune. Then one spring day, she was gone, just like that. No goodbye, no scream, no sound. A bus came back without her, and no one could explain why. The police tried, neighbors whispered, time passed. But Eleanor never stopped waiting. She stayed in that same house, year after year. Every morning, she wrote in her journal, the same way Lily once scribbled in her notebook with colored pencils. She made tea for 2, even though there was only 1 cup ever emptied. And Lily's room, painted pale yellow with sunflowers on the wall, remained untouched. Her bed made, her stuffed bear on the pillow, her backpack still hanging on the door. A room frozen in time, as if any moment a little girl might walk in again. Some called her delusional, others brave. But Eleanor believed in what the Bible once said: faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. She had seen nothing for 18 years, but she still hoped. She still remembered the way Lily's voice echoed in the hallway, the way she'd whisper goodnight at the door, the way she once said, "Grandma, promise me you'll always hear me, even if you can't see me." Eleanor kept that promise. She listened, even in silence. It was a quiet April afternoon. Rain tapped lightly on the attic window, the kind of rain that softens old wood and slows time. Eleanor was cleaning, moving boxes she hadn't touched in years, when her hand brushed the edge of something familiar, the music box. It slipped from the shelf, fell gently, landed on the worn attic floor. The lid popped open, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, it played. The melody was slow, fragile, a little broken in places, but Eleanor knew it instantly. "You Are My Sunshine," Lily's song, the same lullaby they used to hum together, her tiny voice blending with the box's gentle tune, long after the world had gone to sleep. Eleanor knelt beside it, her breath caught, her hand trembling as she reached for the box. The sound filled the attic like a whisper from another life. She opened the lid carefully, eyes scanning the familiar lining. Then she saw it, a loose edge in the fabric, slightly lifted. Her fingers, now slower than before, gently pulled it back. Underneath, folded tight and yellowed by time, was a small piece of paper. 2 words were written across it, in slanted cursive, "Silent goodbye." And beneath that, something else, a hand-drawn map. Pencil lines, faint but deliberate, traced a path into the woods. At the corner, the words "Rocky Creek" were scribbled, almost smudged. At first, Eleanor thought it was a prank. Or maybe a mistake. Some artifact from her past, twisted by hope. But then she looked again. The handwriting. She knew it. That slope of the G, the loop of the Y. She had taught Lily to write like that, slowly, patiently, guiding her hand on summer afternoons at the kitchen table. The realization hit her chest like a slow wave. It wasn't just a message. It was Lily's. Eleanor sat there for a long time, the attic quiet again, except for the ticking of the old wall clock. Outside, the wind had picked up, brushing leaves against the window pane. She felt dizzy, unsure if she was awake or dreaming. But she folded the paper carefully, pressed it to her chest, and carried it downstairs. That evening, she went to the local police station. She told them what she'd found, placed the paper on the counter like it was sacred. The young officer glanced at it, then at her, eyes kind but distant. "Ma'am," he said gently, "it's been 18 years. There's not much we can do now." She nodded, said nothing. She walked home in silence, the folded note pressed inside her coat. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in her armchair by the fireplace, the house dark except for the soft glow of the lamp. She listened, to the wind outside, to the ticking of the clock, and to the music, still echoing faintly in her mind. She remembered Lily's voice, bright and clear, singing over the hum of the music box. She remembered the feel of Lily's small hand in hers, the way her eyes lit up whenever the lid opened. "Play it again, Grandma," she would say. "One more time." Eleanor closed her eyes. She could still hear that voice. She knew now this wasn't imagination. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't madness. It was a message, left for her, waiting all these years. She opened her journal and wrote one sentence. The box sang again. Then she placed the paper map on the table, next to her tea. The edges curled like old leaves. She stared at it for a long time, her fingers resting on the corner, tracing the lines drawn by a child's hand. The forest had taken Lily once. Maybe it still held something she had left behind. Morning was still hours away, but Eleanor was already dressed, her boots by the door, a flashlight on the table. She didn't know what she'd find, but she knew she had to go. The next morning, Eleanor put on her raincoat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and stepped out into the cool spring air. The sky hung low, gray and heavy. Her breath showed in the chill. With the folded map in her pocket, she began her quiet search. Not in the woods, not yet, but in the places where memory lingers. She walked down her old street, past familiar porches and peeling paint, knocking on doors that hadn't opened to her in years. She asked softly, gently, about the summer of 1992, about the camp, about Lily. Most shook their heads. Some frowned. One neighbor, now nearly blind, whispered, "I remember her laugh, like bells." But when Eleanor pressed, the woman turned away. Another muttered, "It's been so long, dear. Best to let the past rest." But Eleanor couldn't. Not now. She went to the town library, its air thick with dust and old heat. She pulled records, yellowed clippings, brittle sheets from faded folders. There were a few articles, brief and cold. 10-year-old disappears during picnic. No leads in counter case. One photo showed Eleanor holding Lily's hat. Her face, then, looked younger, but already haunted. The rest of the investigation files, the interviews, the timelines, were missing. Filed away, misplaced, or simply gone. Like Lily, Eleanor walked to the police station next. The same building, though the front door creaked more now. She waited in the lobby, hands folded tight, the map pressed flat against her lap. A young officer came out, no older than Lily would be now. She explained, her voice steady but quiet. About the music box, the note, the map. He nodded, polite but distant, then lowered his voice. "I'm sorry," he said, "but your granddaughter's been gone a long time. It's unlikely anything will come of this." She gave a thin smile, said thank you, and left. That night, Eleanor dreamed again. In the dream, she was standing at the edge of the forest. The trees swayed slowly, whispering something she couldn't understand. Lily stood just beyond the first row of trees, her hair wild, her eyes wide. She held the music box in one hand, pressed against her chest. She didn't speak. She just stared, like she was waiting. Eleanor woke before sunrise. She sat in the dark, drinking weak tea, her fingers curled around the cup. The house was silent, but it was the kind of silence that pressed against your chest. Later that morning, she returned to Rocky Creek Park. The entrance looked the same, the wooden sign tilted slightly, moss growing on the edges. The air smelled of wet leaves and old stone. She walked slowly, following the trail. The same trail they'd taken that day. The one that should have led back to the buses. But something had pulled Lily away. She reached the clearing where the children had eaten lunch, where volunteers had taken pictures, where laughter once echoed. Now, there was only the sound of birds and the creak of a tree branch swaying above. She searched the ground, the trees, the old stone benches. There was nothing new, nothing changed. And yet, something felt different. A shift in the air. A feeling that this place remembered her. Alone in the forest, Eleanor stopped walking. The map in her coat pocket rustled as the wind blew. She placed her hand on a tree trunk, feeling its roughness, its age. Somewhere in her bones, she felt it. Not logic, not proof, but instinct. Someone had been here. Someone had stayed. She didn't find evidence. No photographs, no belongings, no footprints. But when she turned back toward the parking lot, she did not feel defeated. Hope, she knew, doesn't always arrive with answers. Sometimes it walks beside you, invisible but sure. And in that quiet, damp forest, Eleanor felt it again, stronger now than before. Rain tapped steadily on the windows that night, soft but unrelenting, like the sky wouldn't let her forget. Eleanor sat at the dining table, a single lamp casting warm light over the wood. In front of her lay Lily's old journals, the ones filled with crayon drawings, misspelled words, and the imagination of a child who once saw the world as a place full of wonder. She hadn't opened them in years. Her hands moved slowly across the worn pages, each turn a quiet ache. There were scribbles about school, songs, pictures of dogs with stick legs. Then she noticed something odd. A page sealed shut with aged tape, yellowed at the corners. She peeled it back, the paper crackling under her fingers. Inside was a short sentence, written in uneven handwriting. "Uncle Brian isn't like everyone says. I'm scared." Eleanor froze. Her breath hitched. The penmanship was unmistakably Lily's. And Uncle Brian. She remembered him too well. Brian Greeley, the cheerful man who volunteered at the summer camp. Always smiling, always handing out candy. The children loved him. The parents trusted him. He wasn't family, of course, but everyone called him Uncle Brian back then. It made him feel safer, closer. But Eleanor hadn't heard his name in years. After Lily vanished, Brian left Rivertown quietly. No goodbye, no questions, no trace. Some said he got a job out west. Others said he simply wanted to forget. At the time, no one thought much of it. Now, with that single sentence, everything shifted. Her eyes moved to the opposite page. A rough drawing, done in pencil and orange crayon. It showed a small wooden door, built into the side of a hill. Over it, Lily had scrawled in blocky letters, "Cake Cellar, Secret Place." A shiver ran through Eleanor. She reached for the folded map from the music box. The lines were faint, but as she compared it with the sketch, a shape emerged. The same bend in the path, the same crooked tree. It wasn't just a drawing. It was a memory, a clue. The next morning, Eleanor packed a flashlight, a copy of the map, and Lily's journal. She dressed in layers, tied her boots, and left before sunrise. The forest welcomed her with damp leaves and the scent of old pine. Birds stirred overhead, but otherwise it was quiet. She walked for hours, pausing now and then to compare the trees, the shapes of rocks, the bend of the trail. The deeper she went, the more she felt it, not fear, not even sadness, but a kind of pressure, like the woods remembered her footsteps. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned gray again. Just ahead she saw something, a mound covered in moss, broken branches lying across the top. She brushed them aside, hands shaking, breath shallow. Beneath the green, there was wood, a door, small, warped, and nearly rotted through. It looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. She knelt beside it, ran her fingers along the edge, touched the rusted iron hinge. Her flashlight flickered, casting long shadows into the brush behind her. She placed her palm flat on the wood. It was damp, cold, but it was real, just like in Lily's drawing. She sat back, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. It wasn't just a memory anymore. It wasn't just a missing child and a vanished summer. Something had been hidden here, and Lily, somehow, had known. Eleanor looked up at the sky, clouds thick overhead, the first drops beginning to fall again. Her face was wet, though she couldn't tell if it was rain or tears. She whispered into the wind, "I'm here, sweetheart." Then she opened her journal, traced her finger over Lily's words one more time, and stared at the door that should never have existed. She knew she would return. She had to. The forest was quiet that morning, the air still damp from last night's rain. Eleanor stood alone by the old wooden hatch, her flashlight flickering as she examined the edges of the door. Her hands were cold, her fingers stiff, but she kept brushing away moss and dirt, trying to find a latch, a way in. The wood groaned under pressure, but held firm. She didn't hear him at first, just the faint crunch of boots on leaves. Then a voice, low and cautious. "Ma'am, you all right out here?" She turned quickly, startled. A young man stood at the edge of the clearing, in a dark ranger's coat, one hand resting on the strap of his bag. He looked to be in his 30s, tall, calm, with eyes that seemed to weigh everything before speaking. His name was Luke. Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "I'm looking for something," she said, her voice dry. "Someone, actually." She told him about the music box, the map, the page in Lily's journal. Her words were careful, not pleading, but every sentence carried weight. Luke listened, arms crossed, not interrupting. When she was done, he scratched his beard and said softly, "That's a lot to take in. But you're not crazy, and I believe something brought you here." He knelt beside her, examined the door. "This wood's old," he murmured. "Real old. Haven't seen a structure like this in these woods in years." He began clearing more debris, then paused. Nearby, half buried beneath leaves, was a wooden board, weathered and cracked. He lifted it slowly. The faded letters read, "Food Cellar, Rocky Creek, 1971. Eleanor pressed her hand over her heart. Her breath quickened. Together, they cleared the entrance, uncovering a rusted padlock bolted into the door. Luke leaned back. "I can try to break it," he said, "but we might want to call someone." "No," Eleanor said, more firmly than she expected. "Not yet. Please." He nodded. It took nearly 20 minutes, but with a bit of leverage and a rusted crowbar from his kit, the lock gave way. The hatch creaked open. A wave of damp air spilled out, thick, musty, like old basements and long-forgotten places. Luke shined his flashlight inside. Steps led downward into the dark. Eleanor followed him in. The room below was small, barely taller than a man, with stone walls slick from moisture. Rotting wooden crates lined one side. Shelves hung crookedly. Dust swirled in the light. In the corner, a pile of tattered cloth sat beneath a collapsed shelf. Luke stepped toward it, nudged it gently. A child's blanket lay among the debris, pale pink, soft despite time, and embroidered at the edge with a name, Lily C. Eleanor didn't speak. She knelt beside it, her body shaking. Her fingers brushed the edge of the fabric, tracing each letter like a prayer. Her knees buckled. She dropped to the ground, her hand clutching the blanket, her breath caught in her throat. It was real. It was hers. Luke stood quietly, his face pale. He had seen enough now to believe. "We should call this in," he said gently. This isn't just some old cellar." But Eleanor didn't answer right away. She turned, her eyes searching the walls. There was something else. She could feel it. In the far corner, behind a toppled crate, something glinted in the dust. Luke reached for it, pulled it free. A cracked picture frame. The glass shattered, but the photo inside still intact. A girl smiling wide in a sun hat. And next to her, an older man with gray-streaked hair, one arm around her shoulders. Eleanor's lips parted. "Brian," she whispered. Luke looked at the photo, then at her. "Is that him?" She nodded slowly, tears welling. He was there. With her. The cellar fell quiet again. Only the sound of their breathing, and the hum of something far older than both of them, memory, returning from the dark. The morning after the cellar discovery, Eleanor sat by the window, staring at the blanket now folded on her lap. She had barely slept. Her hands kept drifting across the fabric, as if to make sure it hadn't disappeared. The photo of Lily and Brian lay on the table, next to her teacup, untouched. She had seen that man around children for years, kind, smiling, trusted. But something deep in her bones, something that had once whispered discomfort, now screamed truth. She asked Luke to help her find out more. He made a few quiet calls, reached out to a friend who worked records in Boulder County. By evening, a manila envelope arrived. Inside, old police reports, newspaper scans, and a few faded photocopies. Brian Greeley had once been under investigation, 1990, 2 years before Lily vanished. Possession of prohibited materials. Charges dropped. Not enough evidence. The file ended with one sentence. Subject relocated voluntarily. Case closed. But where did he go? A property deed attached to the file showed a remote cabin leased under a false name, roughly 12 miles north of Rocky Creek. The document dated back to 1993, less than a year after Lily's disappearance. No forwarding address. No sale. Just silence. Luke agreed to take Eleanor. The next morning, they set out before dawn, driving through winding roads where pine trees arched like cathedral ceilings. The trail to the cabin was barely visible, swallowed by vines and years of neglect. Birds scattered as they approached, the only sound in the woods. The cabin appeared slowly, as if emerging from memory. Half its roof had collapsed. Ivy clung to the sides. A broken chair lay toppled near the porch. Eleanor stepped forward cautiously. The air was colder here. She felt it in her bones, in her breath, in the ache behind her eyes. Inside, the floorboards creaked beneath their feet. Mold clung to the corners. Dust swirled with every step. In the main room, broken dishes, torn cushions, and a rusted stove. But behind a curtain made of burlap, tucked into the far end of the house, they found something else. A door, nailed shut with old planks. Luke pried it open. Behind it, a room no bigger than a walk-in closet. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling and yellow. A mattress lay on the floor, thin and stained. Scattered across the space were children's things, a plastic toy phone, a chipped teacup, a stuffed bear missing one eye. Crumbs from biscuit wrappers still littered the corner. And near the far wall, a headless doll, slumped as if waiting for someone to play with her again. Eleanor's breath caught. Then she saw it, hanging from a crooked hook behind the door. A small red raincoat, dirty, torn at the sleeve. The buttons rusted from time, but she recognized it immediately. The coat Lily wore the day she disappeared. She reached for it, her hands trembling. She didn't touch it. She couldn't. Her eyes filled with tears, her body still. The coat swayed gently in the draft, like it remembered being worn. On the wall beside it, barely visible in the dim light, were faint letters scrawled in what looked like charcoal or soot. I was a good girl. The silence became unbearable. Eleanor stumbled back, one hand covering her mouth, the other reaching for the wall. Luke caught her before she fell. "She was here," she whispered. "She was here." Luke nodded slowly, his face pale, voice low. "And he kept her here. For a long time." Time seemed to stretch in that space. Dust hung still in the air. Nothing moved. It felt like they had stepped into a memory that had never been allowed to fade. Outside, the tree swayed, but inside, everything held its breath. Eleanor stood there, her palm pressed to her chest, eyes locked on the coat. The raincoat, The toys. The writing. The room was not a secret anymore. And neither was the horror. The sky was bruised with dusk when Eleanor and Luke stepped away from the cabin. The forest had grown colder, darker, each shadow longer than the last. They moved slowly, the weight of what they'd found still heavy on their backs. Eleanor's hands were tucked into her coat, fingers curled, holding the memory of the red raincoat, like it might vanish if she let go. Luke paused. "Did you hear that?" Eleanor turned, but the path behind them was empty. The tree stood still. No birds, no breeze. Then she saw him. A man, tall and broad, wearing a black hat pulled low. He stood just beyond the trail, half hidden in shadow. His coat was tattered, his face pale beneath the brim. But Eleanor knew. Even after all these years, she knew that walk, that presence, that stillness. Brian Greeley. He didn't speak, just took one step forward, then another. Luke instinctively stepped in front of Eleanor, his voice low. "Go," he whispered. "Back toward the road. Now." But Eleanor didn't move. Brian's eyes locked on hers. "You shouldn't have come back here," he said, his voice hoarse, trembling. She didn't flinch. "What did you do to her?" His mouth twisted, almost in pain. "I kept her safe," he said. "This world, it eats children. Out there, people forget. They hurt them. I didn't." Before Luke could react, Brian lunged forward, grabbing Eleanor by the arm. She cried out, startled, but didn't resist. Her feet scraped against the earth as he dragged her back toward the cabin, muttering under his breath. Luke ducked behind the nearest tree, reached for the old ranger's radio on his belt. The signal crackled. He whispered coordinates. Then silence. Inside, the cabin smelled worse in the dark, like rot, fear, and forgotten air. Brian pushed Eleanor into the main room, slammed the door shut. Boards shifted underfoot. Moonlight spilled through a broken window, painting strange shadows across the walls. He paced, his steps uneven. "I did what no one else could," he said. "She was loved. I gave her songs. She liked my stories. She didn't cry after the first winter." Eleanor's voice was calm, steady. "Where is she, Brian?" He stopped walking. His hand trembled at his side. "She left," he said quietly. "She got away." He looked down at the floor, then back at her. His eyes were wet, but there was no softness in them. Just a deep, rattling chaos. She didn't understand. "I wasn't going to hurt her. I never hurt her." Eleanor took a slow breath. "But you kept her here. Alone. In that room." Brian shook his head, his mouth opening, closing. Then he sank into a chair by the wall and began to sob. Harsh, broken sounds that didn't feel like remorse, only unraveling. Outside, tires skidded across wet leaves. Doors slammed. Heavy boots approached. "Police!" a voice shouted. Luke pushed the door open. Flashlights cut through the dark. Guns raised. Brian didn't resist. He stared blankly at the officers, his hands loose in his lap. They pulled him up, cuffed him without a word. His head hung low. Eleanor stood quietly, watching him being let out. The room suddenly felt too big, too empty. The shadows deepened. Luke returned, his voice soft. "You all right?" She nodded, but her eyes were distant. She looked around the room one more time, her gaze settling on the broken doll in the corner. The wall. The stain of years. "She was here," she whispered again. Outside, the woods remained still. The sky, now fully dark, pressed low overhead. They walked away from the cabin. Luke stayed close, flashlight in hand, though neither of them spoke. The air was thick with silence, and something else, grief, maybe, or memory refusing to die. Eleanor's steps were slow. Her legs ached. Her heart felt too full. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the exhaustion, there was a pull, a knowing, something unfinished. She glanced at the night sky, then whispered, almost to herself, "Lily left something behind. A sign. She wants me to find it." Luke didn't ask what she meant. He didn't have to. The day after Brian's arrest, the police returned to the cabin. This time, they brought ground-penetrating equipment, flashlights, gloves, and patience. From what Brian muttered during his breakdown, They knew there was more, something buried, something hidden behind the trees, just beyond the back of the property. Eleanor stood at the edge of the clearing, her arms wrapped around herself, coat zipped to her throat. Luke stayed beside her, silent. She watched the officers move methodically, brushing aside leaves, prodding the soft earth with metal rods, mapping out a square near the rear fence line. Then a shout. They had found something, a hatch, half covered in dirt and roots, wedged under a tangle of moss. It took nearly an hour to clear. The metal was rusted through in places, the hinges brittle. When the officers lifted the door, a rush of damp, heavy air spilled out. A ladder led down into a second cellar, one that hadn't been touched in years. Luke offered to go down first. The flashlight beam cut through the dark. The space below was dry but cold, lined with stone. The air smelled of mildew, paper, and time. At the far end, resting on a makeshift shelf made of bricks and old wood, was a book, leather-bound, cracked at the spine. Luke picked it up carefully, handed it to Eleanor once she climbed down. Her hands trembled. The pages were full of writing, not Brian's. The letters were thin, careful, slanted just like they'd been in old homework sheets Eleanor used to check. It was Lily's handwriting. The first page read, "If someone is reading this, please forgive me for never being able to speak. I tried, but the words got lost." Eleanor sat on a crate, the book open in her lap. She turned page after page. Lily had written about the room, about the first days, the hunger, the silence, about singing quietly to herself, so she wouldn't forget her own voice. She wrote about dreams, of Eleanor's face, of the box that played their song, of the sound of rain on the roof. Then, something shifted in the writing. Lily wrote about a woman, someone who found the cabin, who brought food, who stayed hidden. She never said the woman's name, only called her the one with kind eyes. She had helped Lily escape, quietly, carefully. One night, when Brian had gone into town, Lily hadn't gone to the police. She hadn't returned to Rivertown. She had been too afraid. Afraid Brian would come for her. Or worse, for Eleanor. So she changed her name, moved states, found work. Years passed. She built a life. She married. She had a child. But she never let go. One rainy night in 2009, 17 years after she vanished, she returned. She didn't knock. She didn't speak. She stood at the window of her old house, heart pounding, hand shaking. Eleanor had been asleep in her chair. The box still sat on the shelf. Lily opened it. She slipped the folded paper inside, the map, the words silent goodbye. Then she closed the lid and left, afraid that if she stayed even a minute longer, she wouldn't be able to leave again. That message, her goodbye, waited inside the box for another 11 years, until Eleanor found it. Eleanor closed the journal, holding it to her chest. Tears streamed down her face, warm against the cold air of the cellar. She whispered the name, barely a breath. Lily. She hadn't been lost forever. She had survived. She had grown. She had watched from a distance, afraid, but still reaching out in the only way she could. Luke sat beside her, quiet. He didn't ask what she'd read. He saw it in her face, the mixture of pain and awe, of loss and return. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves rustled like whispers. Somewhere not far, the forest exhaled. Eleanor stood, the journal in her arms, her voice steady but soft. She's alive. She's been alive all this time. Luke nodded. Then we'll find her. The journal had done more than tell a story. It had pointed a way forward. With the pages and evidence and Lily's handwriting verified, the police traced the few clues she had left behind, cross-referencing school records, relocation databases, and missing persons leads. They narrowed the search to a small town in Oregon. There, under the name Sarah Donovan, they found her. Sarah Donovan, age 28, married, one child, no prior legal records. But her signature, her writing, her birth date, they all matched. A quiet woman who taught piano part-time, volunteered at the library, and lived in a small blue house with white shutters on Maple Street. When the detectives arrived, they didn't wear uniforms. They brought no sirens, only a plain envelope, the old music box, and a worn journal wrapped in linen. They knocked gently. Sarah opened the door. For a second, no one moved. Then she saw the box. Her hands went to her mouth. Her knees buckled. One of the detectives caught her by the arm. She didn't speak. She reached out slowly, almost afraid, and touched the lid. Her fingers ran along its surface, the same way she had as a child. She wound it once. The melody began, soft, broken, trembling. She sank to the floor and cried. It was like waking from a dream she'd been trapped in for years. One of the officers handed her the journal. Her fingers traced her own words. She whispered, "I didn't think anyone would ever read it." They asked gently, "Is it true?" She nodded. Her voice cracked. Every word. She said she still dreamed of the old house, of her grandmother's voice calling her in the dark. "I wanted to go back," she said, "but I thought you might be gone. I couldn't bear to find nothing, or to be nothing to her anymore." But Eleanor had never let go. Back in Rivertown, at the police station, Eleanor sat holding a new photograph. It had just been sent from Oregon. A woman stood by a tree, one hand on the shoulder of a small boy. Her hair was longer, darker, her frame thinner, but the eyes, they were lilies. Eleanor's fingers trembled. She held the photo close, not blinking. Luke sat across from her, watching, waiting. She looked up and whispered, "She's alive." The meeting was arranged within days. No media, no noise. Just a quiet return to the small, white house Eleanor never left, where every morning had begun with the same hope, that someone might walk through the gate again. The day came cold but bright. A silver car pulled into the driveway. The engine cut. The door opened. Eleanor stood at the threshold, one hand on the doorframe, the other over her heart. Her breath caught. The young woman stepped out slowly, a child's car seat in the back. Her coat was gray, her shoes simple. Her hair fell to her shoulders in soft waves. When she looked up, Eleanor saw them, the same eyes, wide with wonder, shining with fear and joy. "Lily," Eleanor's voice cracked. "Is it you?" The woman took one step closer. Her chin quivered. "Yes, Grandma. It's me." Neither moved at first. Then Eleanor dropped her hand from the doorframe and walked forward. Her legs shook. Her hands reached. And Lily, no longer Sarah, no longer hidden, fell into her arms. They held each other for a long time. The world around them fell away. The cold didn't matter. The past didn't matter. Just breath and tears and warmth. Lily whispered, "I'm sorry it took so long." Eleanor's voice was soft. "You came back. That's all that matters." The music box sat on the windowsill inside, silent for now. But its song had already done its work. It had brought her home. Lily stepped forward slowly, her face streaked with tears, breath shallow, hands shaking. She stopped just a few feet from the porch, eyes locked on the woman in front of her. Her voice came out in a whisper. "I'm sorry for making you wait so long." Eleanor didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her arms opened, wide and trembling, as if they had been waiting in that exact position for 18 years. Lily took the final step, and they collapsed into each other's embrace. Eleanor pressed her hands to Lily's back, to her shoulders, to her hair, as if to memorize her by touch. She didn't cry right away. She just held on like she had never let go. They sat together in the living room, where the light was soft and golden, filtering through lace curtains. Eleanor never changed. Nothing had changed here. The armchair still faced the same window. The old clock still ticked faintly on the mantel. On the coffee table sat a cup of cold tea, untouched since morning. And on the shelf, the music box, silent. Lily looked around the room, her eyes landing on the yellowed wallpaper, the framed pictures, the crocheted blanket folded neatly on the couch. "It's the same," she whispered. "All of it." Eleanor reached for her hand. Their fingers intertwined, knotted together like threads that had been frayed but never severed. Lily began to speak, slowly at first. She talked about the first few days in the cellar, about hunger, about silence so thick it made her ears ache. She talked about counting cracks in the wall, drawing pictures on the floor with broken chalk, about dreaming of this room, of Eleanor's voice singing, of the smell of cinnamon and the weight of warm blankets. Eleanor listened without interrupting. Her grip on Lily's hand never loosened. Not once. Lily said, "There were nights I thought I wouldn't survive, but I always saw your face in my dreams. I'd imagine you reading to me, or brushing my hair. That's what kept me alive." Her voice shook. "There was a time I didn't think I deserved to come back. That maybe I was too broken, too different." Eleanor looked at her, tears finally brimming. "What gave you the courage?" Lily reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully, hands trembling. It was the note Eleanor had written and hidden in the music box all those years ago. The one Lily had found and copied when she left her message in return. "Wherever you are, I will wait. Always. You are my sunshine." Lily whispered, "That letter saved me." Eleanor took the paper, smoothed it against her knee. She nodded, then said softly, "A child should never carry the weight of an adult's mistake. You were never the one who left. You were the one taken, and you came home." They sat in silence for a moment, words no longer necessary. The stillness wasn't heavy anymore. It was warm, safe. Eleanor leaned forward and wound the music box. The gears clicked softly, then turned. The familiar melody filled the air. "You are my sunshine," slow and gentle, notes worn at the edges. Lily closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she smiled. In that room, in that moment, time folded in on itself. 1992 was not so far away. The sound of the box, the feeling of home, the warmth of arms that never stopped reaching. It was all here. They sat together, the sun dipping lower behind the window, the music playing between them. Lily whispered, "I missed this. I missed you." Eleanor placed a hand on her cheek. "And I never stopped looking for you." Outside, the world continued. Cars passed, birds flew, clocks ticked. But inside that house, in that small room where grief had lived too long, healing had finally arrived. 18 years. No evidence. No witnesses. No answers. And still, Eleanor never gave up. The town forgot. The headlines faded. The case went cold. But in a small white house at the edge of Rivertown, one woman kept waiting. Quietly. Patiently. Through birthdays missed. Through winters without warmth. Through nights when even memory seemed to fail her. She waited. "Sometimes," she once wrote in her journal, "the only thing keeping us alive is hope. And love never truly disappears. It just waits to be named again." Lily, now Sarah, did not return with headlines, or courtroom drama, or sensational stories. She came back through memory, through silence, through a melody once played in a child's room at bedtime. She returned not because she had to, but because love called her home. Brian Greeley, the man who kept the truth buried, was sentenced to 25 years in prison. But that punishment in Eleanor's eyes was not the true judgment. The true sentence was what he left behind: a broken girl, a shattered silence, and years of stolen light. A child forced to carry the weight of someone else's darkness. But this story was never just about a crime. It was about small things. A music box, a faded piece of paper, a single sentence scrawled by a trembling hand, and the bond between a grandmother and her granddaughter, stretched thin by time, but never broken. It was about a promise kept across decades, a voice heard across silence, a girl lost, not forever, but long enough to remind us that even the faintest signal, a folded map, a song, a memory, can guide someone back. If you believe in things that seem impossible, perhaps this story was meant for you. Have you ever held on to hope, even when the world told you not to? Has love ever carried you through silence? We'd like to hear your story. And if this one moved you, we invite you to share it, to pass it on, because someone somewhere might be waiting for a sign that it's not too late. Thank you for watching Hidden Stories. And remember, sometimes a miracle begins with a goodbye that was never said.